William James, though, targets the first premise. James was he was a philosopher, but he also primarily was a psychologist. He was one of the first, sometimes called the father of American psychology, and he was one of the founders of the school known as philosophical pragmatism. He was a contemporary of William James, and he wrote this essay, The Will to Believe, delivered it as a lecture, I think, partly in direct response to Clifford's evidentialism, or Clifford's rule. And to begin to understand what James's issue with Clifford is, here's Clifford's rule again. It's always wrong to believe anything on insufficient evidence. Now consider this proposition, E. There are an even number of spiders in this room. Now, think of the room you're in. Your evidence presumably neither establishes that E is true, nor does your evidence establish that E is false, unless you went around and paused this and walked around your room and looked. Assuming you're not doing that, though, you don't really have evidence one way or the other for E's truth or falsity. So now consider, if Clifford's rule is true, what are you morally required to do with respect to E? Can you believe it? Well, no. It would be wrong for you to believe it because you don't have sufficient evidence for its truth. Can you believe that it's false? Can you reject it? Can you disbelieve it? Well, no, you can't do that either because you don't have sufficient evidence to believe that E is false either. So what does that mean? Well, anything other than suspending belief altogether, that is, neither believing that E is true nor believing that it's false, simply being an agnostic, anything other than that is wrong. You are morally required, if Clifford's rule is true, to be an agnostic with respect to this question, E. Now, E is silly and unimportant, but William James thinks that there are moments in life that are neither silly nor unimportant. Indeed, there are certain pivotal moments of life in life in which what we value most is at stake. What we personally value most is at stake and depends on what we believe or whether we believe. And in many of those cases, according to James, we don't have enough evidence one way or the other to establish the truth or falsity of what we're about to believe. Clifford's rule, if true, this is boiling down James, if Clifford's rule is true, then we're morally required to undergo a kind of paralysis in some of life's most important moments, when it would benefit us a great deal to simply act, simply form a belief and take a risk. So we went through a few cases that aren't exactly ones James mentioned, but they're all in the spirit of James's cases: the athlete, the patient, and the date. I'm not going to go through the details except to briefly mention them here. So the athlete case, right? By believing that you can win the race, it can make you better. It may even make you win the race. But that belief isn't necessarily based on the evidence you have. You may not actually have good evidence that you're going to win before you believe. The date case is one in which you can imagine if you're somebody who has to believe that the other person likes you in order for you to act with enough confidence to make a date go well, you might need to believe, perhaps even beyond the evidence you have, that that person may really reciprocate your feelings for you. If you don't, you're going to be a nervous wreck, and the date will definitely go terribly, and they definitely won't like you. So in order to get somebody to like you, you may need to have some beliefs about yourself that move a little bit beyond the evidence. Be self-confident in a way that isn't entirely constrained by your scientific analysis of your past. That can actually cause people to like you. And then the patient case is the sci-fi case where belief in the efficacy of this life-saving drug is part of what makes the drug work. In all three of those cases, James thinks there's something at great stake here, something gravely important. something of personal value, an athletic victory, a relationship, friendship, or romantic love, and potentially something medically significant, the effects of this drug in this thought experiment. If Clifford's rule is true, though, we have to be paralyzed when it comes to each of these cases. We're not allowed to believe one way or the other. And that means we're guaranteed to miss out on the great potential goods at stake in each of those cases. So I'm going to try to take this and put it into James's language. He makes a lot of distinctions and he introduces a lot of concepts. They're really simpler than they seem, though. And if you understood what we just did with those cases, you'll understand the more theoretical version. So James uses this idea of a hypothesis, and the other idea is the idea of an option. So let's define those two things. A hypothesis for James is not crucially like a scientific theory. It actually could be a scientific theory, but for the most part, a hypothesis is just something that is proposed to belief. So shall I believe that it's evening right now, or shall I not? Those are two things that are proposed to belief, both hypotheses. Shall I believe that God exists, or shall I not? Two hypotheses. An option is just any choice between two hypotheses. Paradigmatically, either incompatible propositions or the choice between the hypothesis that I shall believe that P and the hypothesis that I shall not do so. James then distinguishes between three different kinds of options, actually 6 different kinds of options. To understand this, you need to understand the idea that a hypothesis can be either live or dead relative to an individual. So if I asked you to believe that the earth is round, that hypothesis is very live to you. Most of you hopefully already believe that. If I asked you to believe that the sun will rise tomorrow, that is very live hypothesis to you. Most likely you already believe that. If I asked you to believe that the earth is flat, or that 2 + 2 is 5, those two hypotheses are dead to you. You can't even imagine believing either of those. A live option is one in which both of the two competing hypotheses are alive. If you are somebody who was neither convinced by the argument for God's existence, nor were you convinced by the argument against God's existence, and you're kind of uncertain, the hypothesis that God exists, the hypothesis that you should believe that God exists, and the hypothesis that you shall not believe that God exists, both of those are live. They're both things you could plausibly do. A live option is one in which both of the hypotheses are live. Forced versus avoidable. A forced option is one in which you have no choice but to accept one of the two hypotheses. In other words, it's impossible for you to not choose. An avoidable hypothesis, though, an avoidable option is one in which you can simply take neither of the two. So the option that consists of believe that God exists or believe that God does not exist, that's an option, but it's an avoidable one because you could simply be an agnostic. The forced option is between the hypothesis that you shall believe that God exists or you shall not. You either have to do one or the other. And then finally, a momentous versus a trivial option. In a momentous option, there's something of great personal value, something you care deeply about, that you consider to be a great good and potentially life-changing, at stake in what you believe, in how you resolve that option. A trivial option, by contrast, is one in which there just isn't much at stake. These distinctions give James what he needs to define his central idea, the idea of a genuine option. A genuine option is a choice between two hypotheses where the choice or the option is live, forced, and momentous. You're choosing between, shall I believe that God exists or not? Both seem live to me. I can imagine believing either one. I have to either believe or not, where not believing includes both agnosticism and atheism. So it's forced. It's also momentous, as James argues following Pascal, in that what you believe has potentially eternal ramifications for the afterlife if God does exist. So we've already mentioned one category of genuine options, self-fulfilling beliefs. The athlete case, the patient case, the case of romantic love and other kinds of relationships. These are cases where belief causes truth. There are two other important kinds of genuine options that James discusses, though. One is religious belief, specifically Pascal's wager, which we'll get to in just a second. The other kind of genuine option is a choice between epistemic norms. Do I care more about gaining truths and knowledge, or do I care more about avoiding error? We'll come back to that one in a second. So, Pascal's wager, the basic idea is to consider the two possibilities. Either God exists or God does not exist. Now, you have a choice between belief that God exists or failing to believe that God exists, where that includes both agnosticism and atheism. Pascal, a 17th century French philosopher and mathematician, said, if the intellect or evidence alone can't determine which of these two I should do, whether I should believe that God exists or not, then maybe what I should do is consider the potential practical consequences in each case. If I believe that God exists and God does exist, I get eternal bliss, an infinite reward. If I don't believe that God exists and it turns out God does exist, I'll receive an infinite punishment. Well, what if I believe that God exists and God doesn't exist? Well, not much. I'll die and there'll be no afterlife, nothing infinite. Any gain or loss will be finite. Likewise, if I don't believe that God exists and God doesn't exist, then hey, I'm right. But kind of who cares, right? Who cares if you're dead? It's certainly not something that is anything like an infinite gain or an infinite loss for that matter. And this is Pascal. Pascal says, well, it's very clear what you should rationally do. Even if your evidence doesn't determine, there are other considerations here. You should wager. You should make the bet. You should bet that God exists because the expected utility of doing so is infinitely high. That's Pascal's wager. That is, for James, another paradigm case of a genuine option. We need one more idea in place, one more definition, and then we can lay out James's argument. Let's say that someone resolves a genuine option. James uses that language a couple times, but I'm going to sort of put it at center stage and do a bit of idealizing. And I think this is faithful to James, but it should help us, I think, clean up some of his argument. So let's say that someone resolves a genuine option whenever they choose one of the two hypotheses in the option. So if the option is the choice between accepting the hypothesis that you shall believe that God exists or not doing so, one way of resolving that is to believe. Another way of resolving it is to not believe. That's what we mean by resolving an option. So this gives us what we need to understand James's argument. At its core is the idea of a genuine option. Call it the genuine options argument. The first premise is this: if Clifford's rule is true, or CR, then it's always wrong to resolve a genuine option. The second premise, GO2, says it is not always wrong to resolve a genuine option. It follows that Clifford's rule is false. So it's clearly valid, and the question is, why does James accept those premises? Let's start with the first one. If Clifford's rule is true, then it's always wrong to resolve a genuine option. Now, why is that? Recall that in order for a genuine option to be what it is, genuine, it has to be a live option, right? So every genuine option is a live option. What does that mean? Well, it's an option that consists in two live hypotheses. They both have to be believable to you if it's a choice between two propositions. Or you have to have enough, you must be psychologically capable of accepting both. Now, what does that mean? Well, if it's a proposition you're considering, suppose that you had overwhelming evidence that that God does not exist somehow. You were just totally convinced by the argument from evil. Then the option of shall I believe that God exists or not would be dead. You could not bring yourself, even if you really tried, to believe that God exists, because the evidence to you seems so overwhelming against it. And on the other side, if you think that the evidence for God's existence is overwhelming, then the question of whether God exists for you is not a genuine option because it's not live. So here we can see that there's a connection between evidence and liveness. No one who is facing a live option, here's the first step of this defense of GO1, has sufficient evidence. Why? Well, because if you had sufficient evidence, the option would no longer be live. If you had sufficient evidence for God's existence, then not believing that God exists would be dead. Conversely, if you had sufficient evidence against God's existence, then belief would be dead. So in order for an option to be live, by hypothesis, we have to be in a position where our evidence doesn't psychologically force us one way or the other. Now pair that with this claim that just basically follows from Clifford's rule. If Clifford's rule is true, then it's always wrong to resolve any option without sufficient evidence. Why? Because Clifford's rule says it's always wrong to believe anything on insufficient evidence. And what does resolving an option mean? It means believing. So it follows that if CR is true, if Clifford's rule is true, then it's always wrong to resolve a live option, because every live option is such that the individual doesn't have sufficient evidence one way or the other. So if Clifford's rule is true, you better not be resolving any options that are live. Now, in one sense, maybe you could go about resolving it, which is to remain agnostic and try to collect more evidence. But the way we're defining resolving, we're talking about forming a belief right here and now before I do any more inquiry. That, if you're faced with a live option, according to Clifford's rule, that's not morally permissible. And now add in that genuine options, all of them are live options. And it follows that if Clifford's rule is true, then it's always wrong to resolve any genuine option. That's the defense of that first premise. Clifford's rule says you cannot morally resolve a genuine option. What about the second premise? We discussed two defenses in class. I'm just going to do one of them here. The other one is important and gets a little bit more into the weeds of what's at stake in genuine options. I'm going to walk through the shorter version, but you should know them both. So why believe that it is not always wrong to resolve a genuine option. In other words, why think it's perfectly morally permissible to believe when you're faced with one of these Jamesian genuine options. James doesn't outright say this, so this is a reconstruction of his reasoning. But I do think that it's supported by some of the things he says. So 2.1 is the ought implies can principle, which says, this is a version of it, if I can't not do something, that is, if I have to do it, like I'm being coerced into doing it, or I'm determined to do it by genetics, or by some weird drug I took, or by God for that matter, if I have to do something, if I have no choice, then it can't be wrong for me to do it. That's ought implies can. If you ought to do something, then it better be the case that you can do it. Conversely, if you can't do it, or if you can't not do it, then it's not wrong for you to do it. There's a deep tie here. There's a lot to be said about the ought implies can principle. Some philosophers accept it, some don't. But the thought is that responsibility goes hand in hand with right and wrong. And if somebody has no choice but to do something, if they're suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, we don't think that their doing it is morally wrong. We don't think they ought not to do it if they have no choice but to do it. If you accept that principle that morality goes hand in hand with ability, then this second premise of the defense of Geo is important. James says, I cannot fail to resolve some genuine options. In other words, I have no choice but to resolve certain genuine options. So James says this, our passional nature, that is, considerations of emotion, of value, of pragmatism, of what's useful, our passional nature, this is not evidence or intellect, not only lawfully may, but must decide an option between two propositions whenever it is a genuine option that cannot by its nature be decided on intellectual grounds. For to say under such circumstances, do not decide, but leave the question open, is itself a passional decision, just like deciding yes or no, and is attended with the same risk of losing the truth. To fail to decide is itself a kind of decision, and one that by necessity goes beyond the evidence. So each, I think, genuine option, many of them, I shouldn't say all of them, many of them fit under this rubric of genuine options that we will all face at one point or another in our lives, according to James, and that we can't avoid resolving one way or the other. The attempt to not resolve one is itself a way of resolving, because if you say, aha, I'm neither going to believe that God exists nor that God does not exist, that's a way of not believing that God exists. And that is a way of resolving the option. The paradigm case of this that James comes back to a number of times is the clash of basic, what are called epistemic norms. The norm of achieving the most truth you can, or the norm of avoiding as much error as you can, or avoiding believing false things. Those are two deeply incompatible principles, and we have to make a decision. Which one do we care more about, gaining truth or avoiding falsity? Clifford, according to James, is obsessed with avoiding falsity or avoiding error. James, on the other hand, prefers to take the risk and get truth if he can, even if it means sometimes being in error. But his point is that there's no one who can do neither of those two things. The attempt to not prioritize truth over avoiding falsity is itself a way of resolving the option in favor of, in this case, going with Clifford, withholding beliefs. So he thinks that we're either going to follow Clifford or not. Those are the only two options. And that itself, the decision about whether to follow Clifford, is a genuine option. It's also a forced option, and more generally, every genuine option is forced, just by virtue of the fact that it's an exhaustive, logically exhaustive disjunction. Either believe or don't. It follows, if ought implies can, if it's true that if I can't not do A, then it's not wrong for me to do A, and it's also true that I cannot not resolve some genuine options, it follows that it is not always wrong for me to resolve a genuine option. Some genuine options, those that I have no choice but to resolve, it can't be wrong for me to resolve them. So it follows from that not every genuine option is wrong to resolve. When you put the two premises together, it follows that Clifford's rule is false. All right, so keep in mind, this is not exhaustive. This was just a review. We moved quickly and left a lot of stuff out, but I hope that was helpful.